At the dawn of the 19th century, the world stood at the edge of transformation. Empires rose and fell not only through conquest but through calculation, desperation, and unintended consequences. In 1800, Europe was consumed by near-constant war, while across the Atlantic, a vast and sparsely populated territory known as Louisiana waited silently, unaware that its fate would soon reshape the course of global history. At the center of this storm stood one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, soldier, statesman, and emperor-in-waiting. Napoleon emerged from the chaos of the French Revolution as both its product and its master. France, once ruled by kings who claimed divine right, had torn itself apart in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolution destroyed the old order but left behind instability, fear, and an exhausted nation surrounded by hostile monarchies. Out of this turmoil rose Napoleon, a military genius whose victories promised order at home and dominance abroad. By the turn of the century, he was first consul of France, wielding near absolute power and dreaming on a scale few men ever dared. Europe at this time was a battlefield without borders. Britain ruled the seas, Austria and Prussia guarded the heart of the continent, and Spain struggled to maintain its fading empire. France was locked in a struggle not just for survival, but for supremacy. Napoleon believed that France's future greatness depended on more than European victories. It required wealth, resources, and strategic depth. For him, the New World was not a distant curiosity, it was a vital piece of a global chessboard. Across the Atlantic lay Louisiana, a vast territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the cold northern plains. It was not rich in cities or population, but it was rich in potential. Whoever controlled Louisiana controlled the Mississippi River, the most important commercial artery in North America. Grain, timber, furs, and future fortunes flowed down its waters. To Napoleon, Louisiana represented the foundation of a renewed French empire in the Americas, yet Louisiana had already lived many lives. Once claimed by France, it had been handed to Spain after France's defeat in the 7 Years' War. For decades, Spain ruled it loosely, using it as a buffer against British and later American expansion. But in 1800, through a secret treaty, Spain agreed to return Louisiana to France. The world did not yet know it, but this decision would ignite fear, ambition, and panic across continents. Napoleon's vision was bold. He imagined a French-controlled Caribbean anchored by the sugar-rich colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, supported by Louisiana's food supplies. Sugar was the oil of its age, and Saint-Domingue was the crown jewel of France's overseas empire, generating enormous wealth through brutal slave labor. Louisiana would feed this empire, strengthen France's economy, and challenge British dominance in the Atlantic world, but dreams formed in Paris often collided with realities forged by nature, resistance, and war. While Napoleon planned in Europe, forces beyond his control were already undermining his ambitions. Disease, rebellion, and the unforgiving distance between continents would soon turn Louisiana from a strategic asset into an unbearable liability. Meanwhile, a young nation watched anxiously from the sidelines. The United States, barely 2 decades old, depended entirely on the Mississippi River for trade. New Orleans was its lifeline, the gateway through which American farmers sent their goods to global markets. When word reached Washington that France, not weak Spain, would now control Louisiana, alarm spread quickly. To many Americans, Napoleon's presence in North America felt like an existential threat. President Thomas Jefferson, a man who believed deeply in agrarian independence and limited government, now faced a paradox. The survival of the Republic might require bold action beyond the Constitution's clear boundaries. Yet in 1800, Jefferson could not know that Napoleon himself was already reconsidering the value of Louisiana. Back in Europe, France's enemies closed in. Britain's navy ruled the oceans, making it nearly impossible to protect or resupply distant colonies. War loomed not as a possibility, but as a certainty. Napoleon understood that defending Louisiana would require ships he did not have, soldiers he could not spare, and money he desperately needed elsewhere. His priorities were shifting, from building an overseas empire to securing dominance on the European continent. The world Napoleon faced was unforgiving. Geography worked against him, time worked against him, and fate would soon intervene through rebellion and disease in the Caribbean. Louisiana, once envisioned as the backbone of French power in the New World, was becoming a burden France could not afford. This was not yet the moment of decision. The sale of Louisiana was still unthinkable to many in France. Empires did not simply give away continents. But history is rarely shaped by pride alone. It is shaped by pressure, by fear, and by the realization that survival sometimes demands sacrifice. As the 19th century opened, no one could yet see the full consequences of what lay ahead. But the fuse had been lit. The collision between Napoleon's ambition, America's vulnerability, and Britain's global dominance was inevitable. Louisiana stood at the center of it all, a silent witness to decisions that would soon redraw the map of the world. The story of the Louisiana Purchase does not begin with a sale. It begins with fire, burning across Europe, across oceans, and within the ambitions of a man who believed history itself could be conquered. Long before the United States dreamed of expansion, and before Napoleon imagined a renewed French empire in the New World, Louisiana was a land defined by uncertainty. It was not a unified colony, nor a thriving center of civilization. Instead, it was a fragile experiment, claimed by empires that struggled to understand, control, or profit from its vast wilderness. Louisiana's history before America is one of ambition undermined by geography, isolation, and human resistance. France was the first European power to stake a serious claim to Louisiana. In 1682, French explorer Robert de La Salle traveled the length of the Mississippi River and declared the enormous region for King Louis XIV. The claim was grand in name but hollow in reality. France lacked the settlers, money, and infrastructure needed to dominate such an immense territory. Unlike the Spanish, who built cities and missions, or the British, who encouraged mass migration, France relied on trading posts, alliances, and scattered forts. For decades, Louisiana remained a distant frontier, thinly populated, poorly defended, and dependent on fragile supply lines stretching across the Atlantic. French colonists struggled against floods, disease, and unfamiliar climates. Crops failed. Starvation was common. Survival often depended on cooperation with Native American nations, whose knowledge of the land far exceeded that of European newcomers. Native peoples were not passive participants in this colonial story. Tribes such as the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Natchez, and many others shaped Louisiana's fate through trade, diplomacy, and resistance. They controlled river routes, hunting grounds, and alliances that could determine whether a European settlement lived or died. French authority in Louisiana existed only where native leaders allowed it, and that authority could vanish overnight. New Orleans, founded in 1718, was intended to be the jewel of French Louisiana. Strategically located near the mouth of the Mississippi River, it promised control over trade flowing from the interior of North America. But the city's early years were marked by chaos. Built on swampland, it suffered from disease, fires, hurricanes, and corruption. Mortality rates were staggering. For many settlers, Louisiana felt less like an opportunity and more like a punishment. Economically, Louisiana disappointed France. Unlike the sugar islands of the Caribbean, it produced no immediate wealth. Fur trading brought modest profits, but not enough to justify heavy investment. France's attention remained focused elsewhere, on European wars and on far more profitable colonies. Louisiana became an afterthought, valued more as a buffer zone than as a source of riches. That fragile balance collapsed in the mid-18th century during the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that reshaped empires. Britain and France clashed across Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and North America. France suffered devastating defeats, especially in Canada. When the war ended in 1763, France faced a harsh reality. Its North American empire was unsustainable. To prevent Louisiana from falling into British hands, France made a strategic decision. In a secret agreement, it transferred Louisiana to Spain, its ally. The handover shocked colonists who had built their lives under French rule. Spain, though powerful, ruled differently, and from much farther away. Louisiana entered a new era, one marked by neglect and quiet survival. Under Spanish control, Louisiana changed slowly. Spain lacked the manpower and urgency to transform the colony. Instead, it governed loosely, allowing French language, culture, and legal traditions to persist. Spanish officials focused on defense, using Louisiana as a shield against British and later American expansion. Forts were strengthened. Trade regulations were relaxed. Smuggling flourished. Ironically, Spanish rule brought stability. New Orleans grew modestly. Immigration increased, including settlers from France, the Caribbean, and even the young United States. Free people of color formed a distinct and influential community. The population remained small, but life became more predictable than it had been under French neglect, yet Louisiana was still not a crown jewel. Spain poured its resources into Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean. Louisiana remained a backwater, important strategically, but never prioritized economically. Its value lay not in what it produced, but in what it prevented. As long as Spain held Louisiana, Britain, and later America were kept at by the end of the 18th century, the world was changing again. Revolutions swept across continents. Spain's power waned. France, reborn through revolution, sought to reclaim its former influence. In 1800, under pressure and persuasion, Spain agreed to return Louisiana to France. Once again, the territory changed hands, this time quietly, through diplomacy rather than war, but the Louisiana France received was not the Louisiana of dreams. It was vast but empty, strategic but undefended, and dependent on fragile systems of control. Its population was scattered. Its loyalty uncertain. Its future unstable. Napoleon inherited not a thriving colony, but a problem waiting to erupt. As news of the transfer spread, fear rippled across North America. American leaders worried about French intentions. Native nations questioned old alliances. European powers recalculated their strategies. Louisiana's value had increased, not because it had changed, but because the world around it had. The story of Louisiana before America is not one of triumph. It is a story of limits, of empires stretched too thin, of lands too large to master, and of people who resisted being ruled from across an ocean. By the time Napoleon reclaimed Louisiana, its fate was already entangled in forces far beyond his control. What appeared on maps as a single color was, in reality, a fragile mosaic of cultures, loyalties, and unresolved tensions. Louisiana was not a prize waiting to be claimed, it was a test. And history would soon reveal that it was a test France could not pass. At the turn of the 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte believed destiny favored the bold. Having seized control of France and restored a sense of order after years of revolutionary chaos, he now looked beyond Europe toward a global future. For Napoleon, true greatness could not be confined to the Old World alone. Empires that endured, he believed, were those that commanded wealth, resources, and influence across oceans. In this vision, the Americas were not peripheral, they were essential. Napoleon's dream was not to recreate the sprawling colonial empires of Spain or Britain, but to build a focused, profitable, and strategically positioned French presence in the New World. At its center would be the Caribbean, where sugar plantations generated enormous wealth. Surrounding and supporting this core would be Louisiana, a vast inland territory capable of supplying food, timber, and manpower. Together, these holdings would form a self-sustaining empire that could challenge British dominance and restore French prestige. The heart of this plan was Saint-Domingue, France's richest colony and the most productive sugar region in the world. The colony generated more wealth than all of Britain's Caribbean possessions combined. Its success, however, rested on a brutal system of slavery. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans labored under unimaginable conditions, producing sugar and coffee that fueled France's economy. Napoleon understood that without Saint-Domingue, any French presence in the Americas would be hollow. Louisiana's role in this imperial design was practical rather than glamorous. Its fertile lands would provide grain and livestock to feed Saint-Domingue's enslaved population. Its forests would supply lumber for ships and buildings. Its rivers would serve as transportation arteries linking the interior to the coast. On Napoleon's maps, Louisiana was the backbone of an American empire, a resource reservoir supporting Caribbean wealth. In 1801, Napoleon moved to turn this vision into reality. He ordered the largest overseas expedition France had ever launched. Tens of thousands of soldiers were assembled and placed under the command of his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc. Their mission was clear: sail to Saint-Domingue, crush the slave rebellion that had erupted years earlier, restore French authority, and re-establish the plantation system. Once order was secured, Louisiana could be fully developed, but Napoleon underestimated the forces he faced. The rebellion in Saint-Domingue was not a simple uprising, it was a revolution. Enslaved people, led by figures such as Toussaint Louverture, had organized disciplined armies, forged alliances, and learned to fight European powers on equal terms. They were motivated not by reform, but by freedom. For them, surrender meant a return to chains. The French invasion initially appeared successful. French troops landed in force, and battles raged across the island. But victory proved elusive. The tropical climate turned deadly. Yellow fever and malaria swept through French ranks, killing thousands. Soldiers who survived combat fell ill within weeks of arrival. Entire units were wiped out without firing a shot. As disease spread, resistance intensified. The rebels adopted guerrilla tactics, drawing French forces into the mountains and forests. Supply lines collapsed. Morale plummeted. Napoleon's grand expedition began to unravel, not through battlefield defeat alone, but through the relentless assault of climate and disease. News from Saint-Domingue reached Paris slowly, but its impact was devastating. The loss of troops was staggering. The financial cost mounted rapidly. And without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana's value diminished overnight. The American empire Napoleon envisioned depended on Caribbean stability. Without it, Louisiana became an isolated outpost, expensive to defend and nearly impossible to supply. At the same time, war in Europe demanded Napoleon's full attention. Britain's navy dominated the Atlantic, threatening any French attempt to reinforce or resupply its colonies. Napoleon faced a strategic dilemma. Every ship sent to the Americas was one less ship defending France. Every soldier lost overseas weakened his position at home. Louisiana, once seen as an asset, now appeared vulnerable. If war with Britain resumed, and all signs pointed toward it, Louisiana would be an easy target. France lacked the naval power to protect it. In a matter of months, the territory could fall into British hands, giving Britain even greater control over global trade. Napoleon was a realist as much as a dreamer. He understood that clinging to an unprotected colony could cost France more than surrendering it. His priorities were shifting. Europe, not America, would decide his legacy. The American empire he imagined was slipping away, undone by forces he could not command. Yet even as doubts crept in, the decision to abandon Louisiana was not immediate. Napoleon weighed his options carefully. Pride, ambition, and strategic necessity collided. Could Louisiana still be used as leverage? Could it be turned into money, rather than lost to an enemy? These questions would soon lead to one of the most consequential diplomatic decisions in history. Napoleon's dream of an American empire did not die in a single moment. It withered gradually, eroded by disease, resistance, and the brutal realities of global war. Louisiana, once a cornerstone of imperial ambition, was becoming a liability France could not afford. What remained was a choice: hold on and risk losing everything, or let go and secure France's future elsewhere. In that choice, the fate of an entire continent would be decided. At the center of Napoleon's American ambitions stood a colony built on suffering. Saint-Domingue, the western half of the island of Hispaniola, was the most profitable colony in the world. Its wealth flowed from sugar and coffee, commodities that fueled European economies and enriched French merchants. But beneath this prosperity lay a system of slavery so violent and exploitative that it sowed the seeds of its own destruction. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue was home to nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans, vastly outnumbering the white colonists and free people of color. Enslaved workers labored under brutal conditions, driven relentlessly to meet rising European demand. Life expectancy was short. Punishment was extreme. Resistance was constant, even when hidden. The colony's wealth came at the cost of unimaginable human suffering. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. Its ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, reached Saint-Domingue in fragmented and dangerous ways. White colonists demanded autonomy. Free people of color demanded rights. Enslaved people listened carefully, drawing their own conclusions from revolutionary rhetoric. If liberty was universal, they reasoned, it could not exclude them. In 1791, the fragile balance collapsed. Enslaved laborers in the northern plains rose in a massive revolt. Plantations burned. Sugar mills were destroyed. Slaveholders fled or were killed. What began as an uprising soon became a revolution, fueled by decades of cruelty and a burning desire for freedom. Saint-Domingue descended into chaos, and France lost control almost overnight. Out of this turmoil emerged Toussaint Louverture, a former enslaved man whose intelligence, discipline, and strategic brilliance transformed the rebellion into a formidable military force. Louverture organized armies, negotiated with foreign powers, and established order where chaos reigned. Under his leadership, the revolution became more than a revolt, it became a movement for independence. France, consumed by revolution and war in Europe, struggled to respond. At times, French officials made radical concessions, abolishing slavery in an attempt to regain loyalty and control. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Saint-Domingue could remain French under a new, more equal system. But this fragile arrangement rested on unstable foundations. When Napoleon seized power in France, he viewed the situation differently. To him, Saint-Domingue was too valuable to abandon, and slavery was too profitable to discard. He believed order could be restored through force. Revolutionary ideals, in his view, had limits, especially when they threatened imperial wealth. In 1802, Napoleon launched his massive expedition to reclaim Saint-Domingue. Tens of thousands of troops arrived with orders to crush resistance and re-establish French authority. Secretly, the goal extended further, to restore slavery once control was secured. For the people of Saint-Domingue, this was an existential threat. Freedom won in blood would not be surrendered. The fighting that followed was among the most brutal of the age. French troops fought pitched battles against revolutionary forces hardened by years of conflict. Atrocities were committed on all sides. Executions, massacres, and scorched earth tactics became common. The island became a killing ground where ideology, race, and survival collided, yet the greatest enemy of the French army was invisible. Yellow fever ravaged the ranks with merciless efficiency. Entire regiments perished within months. Officers fell ill. Hospitals overflowed. Medical knowledge of the time offered no defense. The tropical climate turned Napoleon's greatest expedition into a disaster. Toussaint Louverture was captured through deception and sent to a French prison, where he would die. But his removal did not end the revolution. Leadership passed to men such as Jean-Jacques Dessalines, whose determination matched the brutality of the moment. For them, compromise was no longer possible. Independence was the only acceptable outcome. By 1803, French resistance collapsed. Survivors retreated or surrendered. On January 1, 1804, the independent nation of Haiti was declared, the first black republic in the world, and the only nation born from a successful slave revolution. It was a moment that shattered European assumptions about race, power, and empire. For Napoleon, the consequences were devastating. Saint-Domingue was lost forever. France had sacrificed tens of thousands of soldiers and vast sums of money, only to gain nothing. The economic engine meant to support Louisiana and a wider American empire was gone. Without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana became strategically meaningless. The Haitian Revolution changed everything. It ended Napoleon's American ambitions and forced a fundamental reassessment of French priorities. It also terrified slaveholding societies throughout the Americas, while inspiring oppressed people with proof that freedom could be won. Louisiana's fate was now sealed, even if no official decision had yet been announced. Without the sugar wealth of Saint-Domingue, France could not justify the cost of defending a distant, vulnerable territory. The revolution on a small Caribbean island had altered the destiny of a continent. The blood spilled in Saint-Domingue did more than end slavery there. It destroyed Napoleon's dream of empire in the New World and set the stage for a decision that would reshape the future of the United States and the world. The sale of Louisiana was no longer a matter of ambition, it was a matter of necessity. In the age of empires, power was often measured in armies, ships, and territory. Yet in the Caribbean at the dawn of the 19th century, an invisible enemy proved more decisive than any battlefield victory. Yellow fever, a disease poorly understood and impossible to control, would destroy Napoleon's ambitions in the New World and force France to abandon its most daring imperial project. For European armies, the tropics were a deadly trap. Soldiers arrived confident in their discipline and firepower, unaware that the climate itself was hostile. Yellow fever spread through mosquito bites, though this fact would not be discovered for nearly a century. To the men of Napoleon's expeditionary forces, the illness appeared sudden and terrifying. Healthy soldiers collapsed within days. Fever burned, skin yellowed, and internal bleeding followed. Death often came quickly. During the French campaign in Saint-Domingue, yellow fever struck with relentless efficiency. Camps became graveyards. Ships turned into floating hospitals. Officers who survived combat died quietly in their quarters. No rank offered protection. Napoleon's best-trained troops vanished not through defeat, but through disease. The scale of the disaster was staggering. Of the tens of thousands of French soldiers sent to Saint-Domingue, more than half perished. Entire regiments ceased to exist. Reinforcements sent from France met the same fate. The Caribbean sun and swarming insects accomplished what enemy armies could not. This biological catastrophe had profound strategic consequences. France simply could not maintain an overseas empire without healthy troops. Every attempt to reinforce Saint-Domingue weakened defenses in Europe. Every lost ship represented wasted resources and shattered morale. Napoleon's planners began to recognize an unavoidable truth: the New World was draining France of strength it could not spare. Yellow fever did not stop at Saint-Domingue. Throughout the Caribbean and Gulf Coast, European settlements faced the same threat. Louisiana, with its swamps and humid climate, posed similar dangers. Defending it would require permanent garrisons vulnerable to disease, isolated from support, and dependent on naval supply lines that France could not protect. At the same time, Britain watched carefully. The Royal Navy controlled the Atlantic, ready to seize any French territory left exposed. If war resumed, Louisiana would be indefensible. Napoleon understood that losing Louisiana to Britain would strengthen his greatest enemy and weaken France's global position. Disease reshaped imperial thinking. Where maps once showed opportunity, Napoleon now saw risk. Colonies that could not be defended or sustained became liabilities. Strategic logic demanded hard choices, even when they contradicted ambition. Meanwhile, the Haitian Revolution reached its final stages. French forces withdrew in defeat, leaving behind shattered dreams and unmarked graves. The Caribbean, once envisioned as the foundation of French power, became a symbol of imperial failure. The loss of Saint-Domingue removed the economic justification for holding Louisiana. Napoleon began to reassess his priorities. Europe demanded his full attention. War with Britain loomed larger than ever. France needed money, ships, and soldiers, not distant lands it could not protect. Louisiana, once imagined as a cornerstone of empire, now stood exposed and vulnerable. The question was no longer whether France could build an American empire. The question was whether it could afford to hold Louisiana at all. Selling the territory, once unthinkable, now appeared practical, even necessary. Yellow fever had accomplished what no enemy coalition could. It destroyed the manpower needed to sustain French power overseas. It shattered confidence in colonial expansion. And it forced Napoleon to accept that nature itself opposed his plans. This realization marked a turning point. In Paris, discussions shifted from conquest to calculation. Louisiana became a bargaining chip rather than a possession. The idea of transferring half a continent to a young republic began to take shape, not as an act of generosity, but as a strategic retreat. The collapse of French power in the Americas was not announced with proclamations or ceremonies. It happened quietly, in sickbeds and mass graves, in abandoned forts and silent harbors. Disease had spoken, and even Napoleon had to listen. As the Caribbean faded from France's reach, attention turned northward, to the Mississippi River, to New Orleans, and to the growing nation that depended on them. The stage was set for negotiations that would change history. The fall of French ambitions was not marked by a single defeat, but by the slow realization that some battles cannot be won. In the struggle between empire and environment, nature had prevailed. At the dawn of the 19th century, the balance of global power rested not on land alone, but on the oceans. While Napoleon dominated Europe's battlefields, Britain ruled the seas. This imbalance shaped every strategic decision France made, and nowhere was its impact more decisive than in the fate of Louisiana. Britain's Royal Navy was the most powerful maritime force the world had ever seen. Its ships patrolled the Atlantic, guarded trade routes, and strangled enemy supply lines. For Britain, naval supremacy was survival. For France, it was a constant vulnerability. No matter how brilliant Napoleon's armies were on land, they could not cross oceans without ships, and Britain controlled those waters. As tensions between France and Britain escalated, war became inevitable. Peace treaties were temporary pauses, not solutions. Napoleon understood this reality. He also understood that any overseas colony depended entirely on naval protection. Without control of the sea, distant territories were indefensible. Louisiana was especially exposed. It had few fortifications, a small European population, and long supply lines stretching across hostile waters. In the event of war, British forces could seize New Orleans with relative ease. From there, Britain would control the Mississippi River, choking American trade and expanding its influence deep into the continent. Such an outcome was unacceptable to Napoleon, but so was the alternative. Defending Louisiana would require fleets France could not spare and troops desperately needed in Europe. Holding the territory risked losing it to Britain without compensation. Napoleon's strategy increasingly focused on weakening Britain indirectly. He sought to isolate it economically, cut off its trade, and deny it allies. Allowing Britain to take Louisiana would strengthen the very enemy he sought to defeat. Selling it to the United States, however, would achieve the opposite. The United States was a neutral power, young, expanding, and increasingly wary of European interference. By transferring Louisiana to America, Napoleon could remove it from British reach entirely. The territory would no longer be a prize for Britain, but a barrier to its expansion. This calculation was cold and pragmatic. Napoleon did not sell Louisiana because he admired American ideals or supported republicanism abroad. He sold it because doing so weakened Britain and strengthened a potential rival to British influence. British diplomats sensed the danger. An expanded United States would dominate North America, limiting British power in Canada and reducing opportunities for expansion. But Britain could not stop the transfer without provoking conflict. It was not prepared to fight on American soil. For France, the decision was strategic retreat disguised as opportunity. Louisiana would be lost anyway, either to Britain through conquest or to America through sale. One path strengthened an enemy. The other created a counterweight. Napoleon chose calculation over pride. The looming shadow of global war forced urgency. Negotiations had to happen quickly, before Britain could act. Time was critical. Every delay increased the risk of British intervention. As war clouds gathered, France's attention shifted decisively back to Europe. Napoleon's ambitions there were vast and immediate. He needed funds to raise armies, equip fleets, and sustain campaigns across the continent. Louisiana, distant and vulnerable, could provide those funds if converted into cash. Thus, geopolitics, not generosity, drove the decision. The sale of Louisiana was not an abandonment of power, but a reallocation of it. Napoleon traded land he could not defend for money he could use, and for a strategic blow against Britain. The seas ruled the fate of continents. British naval dominance made traditional empire building impossible for France in the Americas. The Atlantic was not a bridge, it was a barrier. As 1803 approached, the question was no longer whether Louisiana would remain French. The question was who would control it, and how that control would reshape global power. The answer would come not through warships or armies, but through ink on parchment, in quiet rooms far from battlefields. Yet the forces driving that decision were as violent and global as any war. Britain's shadow loomed over every map, every negotiation, every calculation. And in that shadow, Napoleon made one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. The moment Napoleon reconsidered Louisiana, the young United States stood at a crossroads of its own. Barely 20 years removed from independence, the nation was fragile, divided, and uncertain of its future. It possessed vast ambitions but limited power. And at the center of its anxieties stood a single river, the Mississippi. For American farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains, the Mississippi River was life itself. Crops grown in Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio Valley flowed southward to the port of New Orleans, where they entered global markets. Without access to the river, the American interior would be economically strangled. Control of New Orleans meant control of America's future. For years, Spain had allowed Americans to use the port. Its weakness made it predictable. France, under Napoleon, was different. Powerful, ambitious, and unpredictable, France's return to Louisiana terrified American leaders. The presence of a European empire at the nation's western border threatened everything the United States hoped to become. President Thomas Jefferson understood the danger. Though often portrayed as an idealist, Jefferson was a careful strategist. He believed that the survival of the republic depended on land owned by independent farmers, not dominated by foreign powers. A French-controlled Louisiana endangered that vision. Jefferson feared that if France held Louisiana, the United States would eventually be forced into conflict, or worse, pushed into alliance with Britain. Either outcome threatened American independence. He wrote privately that the day France took possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. Yet Jefferson faced a profound constitutional dilemma. The Constitution did not explicitly grant the federal government authority to acquire foreign territory. Jefferson, a strict interpreter of the Constitution, worried that overreach could undermine the very principles the nation was built upon. Despite his concerns, Jefferson recognized that inaction was the greater danger. He authorized secret diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. His instructions were cautious: negotiate for the purchase of New Orleans and, if possible, secure American access to the Mississippi. The idea of acquiring all of Louisiana was beyond imagination. James Monroe was sent to Paris to join the American minister, James Livingston. Their mission was limited and their resources modest. They were authorized to spend up to $10 million, an enormous sum for the young republic, but even that seemed unlikely to persuade Napoleon. As negotiations began, events moved faster than anyone anticipated. French officials, acting under Napoleon's shifting priorities, stunned the Americans by proposing the unthinkable: the sale of all Louisiana. Not just New Orleans. Not just access to the river. An entire continent. Livingston and Monroe were unprepared for the offer, yet they understood its magnitude instantly. Accepting it would double the size of the United States overnight. Rejecting it could mean losing everything to Britain. The decision carried enormous risk. There was no time to consult Congress. Communication across the Atlantic took months. Delay could invite British intervention or a reversal in French policy. The American diplomats chose to act. Jefferson, thousands of miles away, would later struggle with the implications. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it came at the cost of constitutional certainty. In the end, Jefferson chose pragmatism over purity. He would later admit that the Constitution must bend to preserve the nation. The American public, once informed, reacted with a mixture of disbelief and celebration. Critics warned that the purchase would entangle the nation in foreign conflicts and overwhelm its institutions. Supporters saw destiny unfolding. Jefferson's dilemma reflected a deeper truth: nations are often defined not by adherence to ideals alone, but by how they respond to crisis. The Louisiana Purchase was not inevitable. It was the result of fear, opportunity, and bold decision-making on both sides of the Atlantic. For the United States, the stakes were existential. Without Louisiana, the Republic risked being hemmed in by European empires. With it, the nation would gain space to grow, experiment, and eventually dominate the continent. Jefferson did not seek empire. But circumstance forced him to accept it. As negotiations concluded, a quiet revolution occurred, not through war, but through diplomacy. The Mississippi would belong to Americans. The frontier would shift westward. And the balance of power in North America would change forever. What began as fear ended as opportunity. The United States had seized a moment history rarely offers: and in doing so, stepped onto the path of continental power. In the spring of 1803, as Europe braced once more for war, history turned quietly in the drawing rooms and government offices of Paris. No cannons fired. No armies marched. Yet the decisions made there would alter the balance of power across an entire continent. The fate of Louisiana was being decided not on battlefields, but across negotiating tables, in hurried conversations shaped by urgency and fear. For Napoleon, time was running out. Britain's fleet loomed in the Atlantic, and war was inevitable. Every day Louisiana remained French increased the risk that it would be seized by force. Napoleon did not want to see Britain gain control of the Mississippi River. If France could not hold Louisiana, it must ensure that Britain never did. Inside the French government, opinions were divided. Many officials believed selling Louisiana would be an admission of weakness, a betrayal of imperial ambition. Others, including Napoleon's trusted finance minister François Barbe-Marbois, argued that the territory was already lost in all but name. Better to sell it to the United States than lose it without compensation, Napoleon agreed. He authorized Barbe-Marbois to explore a full sale, though the decision was kept secret even within government circles. France would not merely sell New Orleans or access to the river. It would offer everything. The American envoys, James Livingston and James Monroe, were stunned when the proposal was presented. They had arrived prepared to negotiate for a city. Instead, they were handed a continent. The sheer scale of the offer raised immediate questions. Could they legally accept? Could their nation afford it? Would France change its mind? Negotiations unfolded rapidly. Both sides understood the fragile nature of the moment. France needed money. The United States needed security. Speed mattered more than perfection. The price was set at $15 million, a figure that seemed enormous at the time, yet represented a fraction of Louisiana's potential value. France would receive immediate funds and debt relief. The United States would acquire more than 800,000 square miles of land. Legal uncertainties lingered. Boundaries were vague. Native nations were not consulted. European powers watched closely. Yet the agreement moved forward with remarkable efficiency, driven by mutual necessity. In April 1803, the treaty was signed. It transferred ownership of Louisiana from France to the United States. No ceremony marked the moment. Few in the world fully grasped what had just occurred. The secrecy surrounding the negotiations reflected the volatility of the era. Had Britain learned of the talks in time, it might have intervened. Had Napoleon delayed, he might have reconsidered. Had the Americans hesitated, the opportunity might have vanished. When news reached Washington, Jefferson faced his final test. He had feared overstepping constitutional authority, yet he now understood the magnitude of the moment. He chose to proceed, trusting that history would justify the decision. The Senate ratified the treaty later that year. Opposition existed, but momentum was unstoppable. The Louisiana Purchase became law, doubling the size of the United States overnight. Napoleon, for his part, moved swiftly on. The money funded his European campaigns. The decision, though pragmatic, carried regret. He would later acknowledge that he had strengthened a future rival. Yet at the time, the sale seemed unavoidable. The negotiations in Paris were a masterclass in realpolitik. Ideals bowed to strategy. Urgency overrode caution. In a world dominated by war, diplomacy achieved what violence could not. Louisiana changed hands without bloodshed, yet its consequences would echo for centuries. Borders shifted. Peoples were displaced. Nations rose. The most extraordinary aspect of the Louisiana Purchase was not its scale, but its speed. In a matter of weeks, an empire relinquished half a continent, and a republic claimed it, not through conquest, but through negotiation. History often remembers battles and generals. But sometimes, the fate of the world is decided in silence, by men who understand that power can be transferred not only by force, but by agreement. When word of the Louisiana Purchase began to spread in 1803, disbelief followed. Empires did not simply sell continents. Yet that is exactly what had happened. In a single diplomatic stroke, the United States had acquired a territory so vast that even its own leaders struggled to comprehend its scale. The deal sent shockwaves across Europe and the Americas, reshaping expectations of power and possibility. In the United States, reaction was immediate and intense. Supporters hailed the purchase as a triumph of foresight and diplomacy. The Mississippi River was secured. New Orleans was American. The nation's western future appeared limitless. Critics, however, warned of dangerous consequences. They feared the expansion would dilute political unity, provoke foreign entanglements, and strain constitutional limits. Federalists in New England were particularly alarmed. They worried that new western states would reduce their influence and shift power toward agrarian interests. Some even spoke of secession. But the momentum of expansion was unstoppable. The promise of land outweighed political doubt. President Jefferson remained cautious even as celebrations spread. He understood that the purchase carried unresolved questions. What were the exact boundaries of Louisiana? How would the territory be governed? What rights would its inhabitants have? And what would happen to the native nations who already lived on the land? In Europe, the reaction was equally dramatic. Britain recognized immediately that a powerful rival had emerged in North America. The United States, once confined to the eastern seaboard, now commanded the heart of the continent. British influence in Canada and the Great Lakes region faced long-term challenge. Spain felt betrayed. Though it had transferred Louisiana to France with the expectation that it would remain a buffer, it now watched as the territory passed to a growing republic. Spanish officials feared American expansion toward Texas and beyond, a fear that would soon be realized. For Napoleon, the consequences were complex. The money from the sale strengthened France's war effort in Europe, but the long-term impact troubled him. He had removed Britain's opportunity to seize Louisiana, yet he had also empowered a nation that would one day rival European powers. The world had changed, not through conquest, but through commerce. The United States had doubled its size overnight without firing a shot. Such a transformation was unprecedented. On the ground, change came more slowly. For settlers, the land represented opportunity. For Native American nations, it represented displacement. The purchase did not include them in negotiations, yet it sealed their fate. Treaties, removals, and conflict would follow as Americans pushed westward. The Louisiana Purchase accelerated westward expansion and solidified the idea of manifest destiny long before the term existed. It shifted the nation's identity from a fragile republic to an emerging continental power. International observers took note. The purchase demonstrated that empires could fall not only through war, but through economic pressure and strategic retreat. It revealed the limits of colonial ambition in an age of revolution and disease. The deal also set a precedent. The Constitution, once seen as rigid, had adapted to necessity. The federal government had exercised power beyond explicit authorization, and survived. This flexibility would shape future American decisions. Napoleon would later reflect that the sale was one of his greatest mistakes, not because it weakened France immediately, but because it strengthened America permanently. Yet at the time, the decision seemed unavoidable. History rarely unfolds as planned. Napoleon sought to preserve French power. Jefferson sought to protect American independence. Both succeeded in the short term. Only time would reveal the deeper consequences. The Louisiana Purchase was more than a transaction. It was a turning point, a moment when the future opened in unexpected ways. Borders shifted. Destinies diverged. And the world learned that power could change hands not only through blood, but through bargaining. The Louisiana Purchase was completed in silence, but its consequences echoed across centuries. What began as a pragmatic transaction between two nations became one of the most transformative events in modern history. The transfer of Louisiana did not merely redraw borders, it reshaped identities, altered destinies, and set forces in motion that continue to define the world today. For the United States, the purchase marked the true beginning of continental expansion. The nation's boundaries now stretched beyond the Mississippi River into lands few Americans had ever seen. This sudden abundance of space changed how Americans understood themselves. The Republic was no longer a fragile coastal experiment. It was a continental power in the making. Land meant opportunity. Millions of settlers would eventually move westward, seeking farms, wealth, and freedom. New states would rise from territories once claimed by European empires. Rivers became highways of commerce. The Mississippi transformed into an American artery, binding the nation together economically and politically, yet expansion carried a dark cost. Native American nations paid the highest price for the Louisiana Purchase. Though the land changed hands between empires, indigenous peoples were not consulted, compensated, or protected. American expansion brought broken treaties, forced removals, and violence. Entire cultures were displaced as settlers advanced westward. The Purchase also deepened America's greatest internal contradiction, slavery. As new territories opened, the question of whether they would permit slavery threatened to tear the nation apart. Compromises delayed conflict, but they could not resolve it. The land gained through the Louisiana Purchase would become the battleground of America's most devastating war. Internationally, the Purchase signaled a shift in global power. European empires, long dominant in the Americas, began their retreat. The United States emerged as the primary force in North America, shaping trade, diplomacy, and conflict for generations. Britain adjusted its strategy. Spain's influence collapsed. France turned inward, focusing on Europe. Napoleon's decision, made under pressure and necessity, had unintended consequences. By selling Louisiana, he removed a vulnerability, but also created a future rival. The United States would one day eclipse France's global influence, fulfilling a prophecy Napoleon himself reportedly acknowledged. The Purchase demonstrated a new kind of power, one rooted in negotiation rather than conquest. It showed that diplomacy, backed by strategic calculation, could achieve what armies could not. This lesson would influence future American expansion, for better and for worse. Thomas Jefferson's legacy was forever altered. Once a cautious constitutionalist, he became the architect of American expansion. His decision revealed the tension between ideals and survival, a tension that continues to shape democratic governance. Over time, the Louisiana Purchase became mythologized as destiny. But it was not inevitable. It was the product of fear, disease, war, and human decision. Had events unfolded slightly differently, had yellow fever spared French troops, had Britain moved faster, had negotiations failed, the map of the modern world might look very different. The Purchase also set a precedent for American confidence. It taught the young republic that bold action could secure its future. That lesson would be repeated, sometimes recklessly, as the nation expanded from coast to coast. In the end, the Louisiana Purchase was neither purely noble nor purely cynical. It was human. It reflected the hopes, fears, ambitions, and limitations of the people who made it. Its consequences were vast and uneven, filled with progress and tragedy alike. History rarely offers clean victories. It offers choices, and the Louisiana Purchase was one of the greatest choices ever made. From a deal struck in distant Paris emerged a nation transformed and a world reshaped. What Napoleon sold, America inherited. And in doing so, the course of history changed forever.